Matthew chapter 5. We're going to look at the Beatitudes today. I'll read verses 3 through 6. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. We have been looking seems like forever, but last three or 4 months or so, I think. This is message number 13, so 3 months or so? In the last 3 months, we have been looking at the teachings of Jesus. But one of the emphasis that I think we've been trying to emphasize this particular year is how do we live as a disciple? What are the characteristics that sets a disciple of Jesus apart? Because we go back to our mission statement, is we are trying to become men and women who mature in Jesus, a disciple, a person that is growing as a disciple. And throughout these teachings of Jesus, I've tried to at least highlight characteristics, how your life ought to be or look like. And I'm going to wrap up the series with the Beatitudes. So we'll look at part 1 today, these 4, and we'll look at the second 4 next Sunday, and then we'll move on to another series. But when we look at the Beatitudes, it's interesting that Matthew starts off his Sermon on the Mount with the Beatitudes. And I feel like in some way we've been working back towards this. And the reason why we come to this, and the reason why I think this is a fitting way to end this series, is because when we see the Beatitudes, when we see the list of the 8 characteristics or attributes that are listed, I look at that and I think, you know what? Isn't that what a disciple should look like? So in a sense, when I look at the Beatitudes, it's listing qualities that should be found in disciples. A few weeks ago, we distinguished we made a distinction, not just a disciple, but a true disciple. So a true disciple would have these types of attributes, or these characteristics in their life. So that's kind of the angle that I'm looking at. So when we look at this, we see there's a pattern. Each verse begins with the word blessed. Blessed. And I think we need to try to define that word a little bit. We tend to think of blessed as happy. Blessed. Happy are those who are poor in spirit, or something like that. But I think happy is an element of it, but I think there's something a little bit more than that, a little bit deeper. And one definition says this: this term blessed is an exclamation of the inner joy and peace that comes with being right with God. Let me read that again. It is an exclamation of the inner joy and peace that comes with being right with God. See, it's more than just happiness. For someone to be blessed, there is this sense of inner joy and peace that comes with being right with God. The word joy and happiness are not the same. Happiness, to me, happiness is dictated by circumstances. Oregon State and Oregon fans, we are so sad. We're not happy. Daniel, for once, is happy. We're not happy because why? Circumstances. June is ecstatic because his Patriots are 3-0. And every week you guys lose a quarterback. So happiness is really dictated by external circumstances, but joy is not. Joy, when you have joy, external circumstances really don't affect it that much. Not to the degree that like happiness would. So the word blessed is this idea of an inner joy and peace. An inner joy and peace. Blessed. So it's a little bit more than happiness. And we need to understand that this is what the Beatitudes, the beginning of each of these verses, that's what it's trying to say. The first Beatitude is verse 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. I wanted to try to reword these Beatitudes in a way that I think, hopefully, in a way that I think would allow us to understand the Beatitudes a little bit better. Because I think there's a lot more depth to each of these Beatitudes than just meets the eye. So for the first point this morning, I would translate or interpret that verse 3 to say this. Blessed are those who acknowledge their desperate need for God. Blessed are those who acknowledge their desperate need for God. A better way to understand verse 3, the poor in spirit, a better way to understand that is to look at what is not, the opposite of that. The opposite of the poor in spirit would be the arrogant or arrogance. The poor in spirit is the opposite of the arrogant self-confidence that someone might have, which treats God as irrelevant. Which treats God as irrelevant. It is saying that, you know what? I put confidence in my own self. I put confidence in my own abilities. God is irrelevant. That is the opposite of the poor in spirit. The arrogant or the arrogance believes that we have something to do with getting into heaven. Because it says, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The arrogant think, I have a way. I have some input based upon what I do to get into heaven. Arrogance causes us to sit in the driver's seat and drive ourselves to the destination, which is heaven. You see, the poor in spirit, they acknowledge their dependence on God. They acknowledge their desperate need for God. The poor in spirit are those who are in total dependence on God. Blessed are those who are in total dependence on God. Those who acknowledge a desperate need for God. In Luke chapter 18, verse 9 through 14, Jesus tells a story about a Pharisee and a tax collector. They go to the temple to pray. The Pharisee is told that he kind of, dear God, thank you that I am not like that sinner, the tax collector. He kind of puffs up his chest and he prays this loud prayer where everybody can hear. And Jesus says, the tax collector, he can't even go inside. He can't even go inside. And what he's doing is he's what? He stands at a distance. He can't even look up into heaven. He's looking down and he prays. And he says this, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Two different people, the contrast of the two. The poor in spirit is not like the Pharisee. That would be the opposite of what I think Jesus is communicating here. The poor in spirit is like that tax collector who says, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Because he acknowledges us that he can't even stand in God's presence. That he has nothing on it based upon his own merits that would even allow him to come into the presence of God to pray. There's nothing that I can do. He just keeps his eyes down and he simply asks God for mercy. That is the poor in spirit. A quote that I read this past week, I think really kind of captures this, is this. The poor in spirit are those who cast themselves on God's grace. The poor in spirit are those who cast themselves on God's grace. I love this because it says that we are literally at God's mercy. We would be lost and hopeless without God's grace. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Billy Graham writes this: when we come to God, we must realize our own sin and our own spiritual emptiness and poverty. We must not be self-satisfied or proud in our hearts, thinking we don't really need God. See, the poor in spirit, they come with this kind of mentality, this kind of position. We come before God empty. We come before God in terms of this poor in spirit, spiritually poor, and acknowledge that we have nothing, that we're simply dependent on God. Blessed are those who acknowledge their desperate need for God. Second beatitude says this: blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And I rewrote this one to say this: blessed are those whose hearts ache because of the brokenness in the world. The term mourn, it means to experience deep grief or sorrow. Deep grief or sorrow. And and sometimes the circumstances in our life, it causes us to have that moment of deep grief and sorrow. When certain tragedy happens, someone close to you, a family member passes away. We're saddened by that, but when it happens to somebody older, we're saddened, but we think, they've lived a full life. But when it happens to someone younger, it's a little bit more challenging. There was a 17-year-old high school student who was battling a form of cancer that was pretty rare, I think. And during our pastoral staff meetings, we kept on getting a lot of updates, weekly updates about her situation. And we just, all we can do is just pray. And we really cried out to God. Sometimes news was positive, other times it was a little bit less. But one day, we got an email that said that she passed. Our pastoral staff, we were affected by that, but especially the high school pastors and people who really knew her and walked with her. That's grief, that's sorrow. We imagine what her parents, how they must have felt. Another time, one of the Korean small group ministries, they went out on an outing with the families, and there was how old was that baby? A toddler and a bunch of other kids were playing. And there was some kind of a structure. I think it was one of those water fountain structures, but it was like 2 or 3 different pieces. And the kids were playing on it and pushing on it, and the top part fell down onto the toddler. And we went through that process of grieving with that family. So when it happens to someone younger, we feel a deeper sense of grief or sorrow. That is what mourn means. We mourn, we experience a deep grief or sorrow. Not just the circumstances, not just the events of our life, but what is this verse talking about? It's not just talking about those circumstances, but I believe blessed are those who mourn. I think the deeper meaning here is blessed are those who mourn, who grieve, who have sorrow because of sin. See, we experience a form of mourning or grief or sorrow when we fall to sin. The older we are, the older we get, and when we fall to, or when we fail to sin, and when we fall to sin, our sorrow and our grief is greater, deeper. Because we're thinking, why can I still not have mastery over this? Why do I still struggle with this? Why can't I be victorious? So, blessed are those who mourn for what? For sin. Sin in our own personal lives. Not just our own life, but I think blessed are those who mourn. Also gives us idea that we mourn not just for the personal struggles of sin, but we also grieve for a world that is lost, in which God and His will do not prevail. That we mourn, that we grieve, and we are filled with sorrow for not just our own sin, but sin in this world that is lost, that is broken. A world in which God's will do not prevail. And isn't that a perfect example or description of what's happening in our world today? How else do we explain what's going on but to say our world is broken? That we live in a world where God's will does not prevail. God's will is not dominant in the lives of men and women, young and old. It cannot. If it is, we would not be, every time we turn on the news or get on our phones, we would not be hearing about some tragedy. Just this past week, think about the events that happened in our country. Just 2 days ago, Washington, Burlington, Washington. Some guy walked into a Macy's store with a rifle, and he shot up a bunch of people. 5 total have now died. It's almost a year ago already, down in Roseburg, when that gunman shot people in that school. I'm tired of hearing about people dying. You know, the ones that always get the headlines are the police involved fatalities. Those are just causing up a major interracial tensions in America. Charlotte, North Carolina, right? Protests are going on like crazy every single day. Why? It's because this is a broken world. God's will does not prevail. As Christians, what is our response? Does your heart ache when you see that? You know what else besides the ones that captured the news? In Chicago, this year alone, there have been, I don't know how many homicides. They're on record pace. If you actually pay attention and read the fine prints of the news, it wasn't a few months ago maybe, near the Lloyd Center, there was a shooting. And a young person was killed. In certain neighborhoods on the east side, there was a drive-by shooting. A couple houses were hit. We read about some guy who decides to go to the Mall of America and stab a bunch of people. I believe 9 people he attacked. We read about news about somebody who detonates bombs in New Jersey and New York. How do we explain what's going on? Except to say, this is a broken world. We are living in a broken world. We're living in a world where God's will does not prevail. to all of this, but there's a heartache for that. Blessed are those whose heart aches for the brokenness in our world. A true disciple mourns for this broken world. A true disciple will pray for God's presence to fill the hearts of the people in this land. In some ways, I feel like I'm reading 2nd Chronicles again. How we are in desperate need for God to come and heal this land. That's what we are. And that actually is a call by many of, actually not many, but I forget his name, from, what is his name? Franklin Graham, Billy Graham's son. He made this call out this week and said, as Christians, it is our duty to gather together, get on our knees and pray for this nation. We need to pray that Jesus reigns in this land. Blessed are those who mourn for the brokenness, who grieve, or who are filled with sorrow for the brokenness in this land. Third beatitude says, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who delight in submitting to God's will. Blessed are those who delight in submitting to God's will. One of the problems with the word meek is that it rhymes with weak. And so many times people look at this meek or meekness and they see it as a weakness. Think about it. In our day and age, you must demonstrate strength, confidence. Think about your workplaces. You have to. If you show meekness, which people think is weakness, you're not going to get promoted. People will walk all over you because they'll see you as, I don't have to worry about John. He's meek. That's kind of the idea that we generally associate with this word. Passivity, a person that is passive. Someone who can easily be walked all over. Someone who is easily imposed upon. That's some of the definition of the word meek. But in the Bible, the word meek is a very strong word. It's a very powerful word, actually. The Greek term does not suggest weakness. However, rather, in the Greek language, the word meek, it denotes strength brought under control. Strength brought under control. The Greeks often use this word to refer to a wild horse that is tamed or brought under control, right? A bridle, which is what they put over the horse's face, right? In the mouth. That's how they control the horse. A wild horse that is tamed, that is brought under control. That is this idea behind the word meek. It does not denote weakness at all. Strength brought under control. Strength brought under control. There's a Greek scholar, his name is W.E. Vine. He has some books that he has written. He says this about meekness. He says that meekness in the Bible is an attitude toward God in which we accept his dealings with us as good. It's an attitude towards God in which we accept his dealings with us as good. And therefore, without disputing or resisting. We say, you know what, God, how you deal with us, how you treat us, we accept it as good. Therefore, since we accept it as good, there is no resistance. There is no protest. And we see this in Jesus, who accepted it and who followed God's will. Jesus delighted in submitting to God's will. Doesn't mean that he didn't question or have some concerns, as we see in the Garden of Eden, or Garden of Gethsemane. He said, Lord, if it's possible, take this cup from me, right? That is that moment where he says, you know what, I am all about doing your will, but what I'm about to face, if it's possible, take this cup from me. But not my will, but your will be done. Jesus understood his mission. You and I, we are brought into this world. We don't have a conclusion. We don't know the ending. If we knew the ending, it might alter the way that we live. Jesus knew the ending. It didn't alter it. He went straight for it. That is what this idea of meek demonstrates. Not just weakness, but strength brought under control. But more importantly, accepting God's dealings with us as good. And therefore, not resisting or protesting. When's the last time you accepted God's dealings with you? We complain all the time, God, I can't believe this is happening. You see, just on the surface, this seems like blessed are the meek, humble. Blessed are the humble, for they will inherit the earth. That's kind of how we always understand this. But an attitude towards God in which we accept his dealings with us as good, and therefore without disputing or resisting. The idea of the meek or the meekness is anything but weakness. The meek emulate the nature of Jesus in their lives. Jesus continues to be a constant example for you and I to follow. He accepted God's dealings, his Father's dealings to him as good. He accepted it as good. Many times we pray, God, I don't know why I'm in this situation, but would you take me out of this situation? It's a form of resisting, protesting. But to say, you know what, you brought me into this situation. I accept. I don't like it, I don't understand it, but I accept it as good. Blessed are those who accept God's dealings with us as good, and therefore accepts it, submits to God's will. The last beatitude this morning is this: the blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after God. You know, the New Living Translation translates the word righteousness as justice. As justice. I think the NLT says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice. Most of us, we can't ignore hunger or thirst. Right? When you're hungry, sometimes you get angry. There are those who become hangry. You know, my daughter is that way. When she's hungry, she gets angry. I worked with a pastor who, during the middle of our meeting, he'd be like, hey, are we done? I'm like, no. And he starts kind of being a little antsy. We're like, are you hungry? He's like, yes. So, okay, we'll try to wrap up. But the longer it goes, he'll just get up and start digging, rummaging through, looking for food. We're like, can you sit down? We were talking about trying to have a meeting. He's like, I know, but when are we going to be done? So after the first couple of times, we started bringing food to the meeting. Because I don't know why, but our meetings were always like 2 hours long. So many things to talk about. So we bring food, set it down in front of him. And as we're having our meetings, he would need to eat. He had to eat because he cannot respond. He needed to respond to hunger immediately. you and I, we respond to hunger and thirst. When we don't eat, we get hungry. When we don't drink, we get thirsty. This is a problem that you and I will face for the rest of our lives. This is just part of our life. Dead people don't have to worry about this. They don't have to deal with hunger and thirst. But for as long as we are alive, hunger and thirst are something that's just a natural part of our life. And we really respond to a hunger and thirst. We will not ignore our body's call for food. We tend to it. We give in. This beatitude, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. On the surface, if we understand righteousness as being right with God, we all desire that. We all want to be right with God. I think what verse 6 is actually kind of communicating a little bit more is that the degree of that pursuit. What I mean by that is there are people who want to be righteous or seek righteousness, but how are they pursuing after that? Is that a passion in your life? We all want to pursue righteousness, but is that your passion in life? In your personal life, okay? In your personal life, do you have a passion to seek after God, to pursue God, to please God, to do what God wants you to do? To do what God wants you to do no matter the cost. What about this world? Do you hunger and thirst for righteousness in this world that is filled with unrighteous and injustices? I think one of the reasons why NLT translates as justice is because blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice. Many Christians, they take up different social causes that are close to their heart. People who deal with sex trafficking, for example. I know people who are heavily invested in trying to stop or trying to bring awareness and stop to sex trafficking. And many times is, young men, young girls and boys are taken from their homes and shipped overseas. It's not like, oh, I want to be into this industry and I volunteer. It's not the case. It's usually through kidnappings or through other forms. And when they are coming from the U.S. and they're shipped to wherever countries, that's a hot spot, mainly Southeast Asia. When that's being done, they're being transported by airlines. And many times airlines have no idea what's going on. So how do you bring an awareness to this? Whatever social cause, poverty, homelessness. Homelessness is an issue in our city. And we constantly hear and see stories of people who are constantly displaced. But homelessness is not brought upon by just the fact that you don't have a job or anything like that. So many people are being displaced. I was reading an article about an apartment complex where new owners from Los Angeles, that evil place, Los Angeles, sorry Bradley, from Los Angeles, these guys, they bought this apartment complex. And they sent a 90-day notice to all of the tenants, which means you guys are being evicted or you have to move out. And they changed the name of the apartments. And the rent there used to be very cheap because it was kind of meant for lower income. $600 or $650 is what this family was paying. And now the rent is going to be $1,300, doubling. Because the new owner wants to see this property and they want to, quote unquote, this is what the manager said. We want to raise up the quality of living in this community. And these residents, Oregon law they don't have a law that protects residents in this kind of a case. So basically, these people, the person that they interviewed had lived there for 10 years, paying $600 or $650 a month for him and his family. Now the rent jumps to $1,300, and the new owners are saying, hey, you're more than welcome to come and apply again, but you will have to pay $1,300. So these people are starting to move out one by one. Homelessness is not just brought upon by people that we see that generally associate with being on the street. These people, many of these residents, they cannot afford $1,300 or whatever it costs to live around there. And one of them is like, I will be homeless. So it's an issue in our world. These injustices, what do we do? As Christians, how do we respond to this? John Piper says this, could it be that one of the reasons the grass is greener everywhere you look is that your life is not devoted to the central pursuit of righteousness, but to the pursuit of other things? Let us consider with what regularity and perseverance and strong urges we pursue food and drink day after day. And let us make it our prayer that we will hunger and thirst in the same way to establish righteousness in our own souls and in all of our relationships and in our land